The topics, as I told you, is centered around most important clinical practical aspects. Without taking any time, may I now invite the first speaker of the evening, no less than Professor Dr. Krishna Seshadri, popularly called as Krishna or Keshu, to give the first presentation. Can I have the bio which can come on the screen, please? I don't need a bio for Krishna to be introduced. Do you have the presentation, Hardik, Krishna's bio? Can you focus it? Dear friends, if you want to pick up somebody in the country today whose contribution to the clinical endocrinology, to the practical endocrinology, and to the academic endocrinology at the same way have been beyond description, taking it to highest heights, he is Professor Dr. Krishna Seshadri. He is American board certified in endo, diabetes metabolism, and also in internal medicine. Believe me, he takes the exam periodically, which is not necessary to just keep his knowledge abreast of the latest. He is the presiding officer at the Chennai Diabetes Endocrine Clinic and the clinical research lead at the Apollo Sugar Clinics. He is the senior consultant at the Apollo Hospitals. He is the visiting professor of endocrinology and medical education, Sri Balaji Vidyapeeth, and he also wrote the introduction to the new curriculum for the undergraduate. Recipient of many awards, I will not take time, and he's he has funded the translational research on the gut microbiota, inflammation, vitamin D, glucose transport, etc., etc. He has been the president of the Endocrine Society of Tamil Nadu, the Trendo, the associate editor of many journals. He has many interests, but dear friends, I must tell you, above all, it's a great human being. He's a scholar in Sanskrit. You ask him about the life, about the science, about the culture, he will listen volumes and volumes. Let me start the first session by asking him to speak a story that I'll narrate now. You know, when Nachiketa from the Indian mythology met Jama asked Nachiketa a simple question. Human being knows that they have to die one day, but why every human being wants to be immortal? That is what Nachiketa's question. Dear friends, he's going to speak to us. How can we maximize? Again, I repeat, how can I maximize the treatment benefits with affordable drugs in our armamentarium? How can we give a longer life? How can we bring the drugs, the cost of the care, which can be most affordable? You know, Indian doctors, Indian people with diabetes are brand conscious. At the same time, they're also cost conscious. He's going to speak to us on this very important topic, how we have a effective therapy, at the same time, a cost-effective therapy, which can maximize the benefits and give a longer life to our people with diabetes. I present you, dear friends, this phenomenal person called Professor Dr. Krishna Seshadri to deliberate on this subject. And after that, we'll have a very lively discussion. Krishna, all is yours.
Thank you, Professor Das. First let me acknowledge Dr. Das's contribution in helping me become a better physician, clinician, endocrinologist, and more importantly, someone who's humble and listens to people and encourages them. That indeed is Dr. Das's contribution, that he has been a role model for so many of us. A very interesting topic. I promise you, I never had these slides before. I actually spent a lot of time thinking about it, and in fact, couldn't get the right kind of talk in, and then finally sat and got myself inspired to think about it yesterday and did it. So let's start with the patient. The 45-year-old man was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, a clerk in a bank. His salary is about $32,000 per month. This is generally, by the way, the average salary of a clerk in any bank in the country. His wife supplements the income by taking tuitions. He has 2 children with aspirations to study much more. They are in a private school. He smokes 5 cigarettes a day and takes a multivitamin. He's worried about his diabetes and wants good care. That is why he chose you. At the same time, he's worried, doctor, I hope you don't write costly medications. he goes and gets the first testing in the lab based on what you have told. His A1C is 7.5, EGFR of 98, and LDL of 140. Urine albumin creatinine ratio of 28. I'm sorry, it's not there. And BMI of 24, blood pressure of 145. He had a foot exam that was normal. He had a fundus exam that was also normal. So let's think a minute about what is the most cost-effective way to practice medicine. It must be cost-effective, but it should also be very effective, right? So what I did is I put together some things for you to think about. It may not be perfect, but it's to make us think. As a basis, I'm assuming that this information that has been provided, source of the Economic Times, is the average income per India, all of us put together, is about 270 rupees per day. So if you take 30 days, right, you have about 9,000 rupees. That's the average income. Most of us make more than that. I think this we also need to look at it that, for example, a driver in one of your homes is probably taking home around 16, 17,000 plus bata. So about 22, 23,000 for a family of 3 or 4. Let us look at the cost of this care. I've included most of the brands. I actually spent time looking at what is the lowest and the highest. I didn't put a mean, but maybe when we try to get this published, we will put a mean into it. Let's look at the supporting drugs. Ramipril, the highest is 18 rupees. Telmisartan between 0.8 and 15.5. And this is cost per day, right? Hydrochlorothiazide. I couldn't find the right numbers for chlorthalidone. Hydrochlorothiazide between 90 paisa and 1 rupee 30 paisa per day. Amlodipine between 1 rupee 15 paisa and about 5.4. Statins, rosuvastatin 10 milligram is the lowest is 8.5, but the highest, which is cost is around 18 rupees. Atorvastatin, the lowest cost is around 2.4. So most of the recognizable brands usually follow in between some of these Indian brands. The MNC brands sometimes higher, but not always so. Some of the Indian brands can be higher than the MNC brands. And aspirin, of course, is between 13 and 45 paisa. That is the entry quoted variety. I use glimepiride 2 milligrams as a cost. So if you notice, it's between 2.4 and 15 rupees per day. Metformin, the lowest is less than 2 rupees. Highest is 4.5 rupees. Vildagliptin, remember, it's 2 tablets. So 50 milligrams, 2 tablets. So it costs per day is around 9.5 rupees. And at the highest, it can be 40 rupees per day. Dapagliflozin, now with all the generics coming, the lowest cost is 12.3 and highest is 2.28 rupees. Empagliflozin, the only brands that are available are co-promoted, so 51 rupees per day. Pioglitazone, 15 milligrams is about 2 rupees per day, the highest being 8.5 rupees. And calculating for about 15 units per day, glargine, and that too the pen fill is 24 rupees per day. If you use a vial, which I don't think any of us should in this day and age, we can help patients get pens. It's much cheaper. But if you look at this, not much, isn't it? Especially if you take the effort and choose the brands that give this thing. Of course, the quality varies, and that's a regulatory issue. I won't get into it. It's a government's responsibility to make sure that only the brands with the right bioequivalents are in. But the thing is that India is not like the rest of the world. The competition that the pharma industry faces in India, and the pressure on them to keep the drugs at lower costs are quite high, which means there is no excuse to not do the right thing. I also believe that, that even the poorest deserve the best of our care. Just because somebody, and in this way, I disagree with the ADA position, When cost is a concern, no, cost should not be a concern. We should be able to do the best for our patients. We find the right ways to do it, find the right social net, but every patient deserves the best care. So how do you do that? The first thing is to remember that it's cost effective to prevent complications and treat them. A lot of times patients feel, why am I getting treated? This is only numbers. But you know what? Very interesting study. I'll show this to you. This is from the Manipal Heart Registry that looked at heart failure. I used heart failure simply because this was the best information available. You can create the same for heart disease, for kidney disease, for any of the others, eye disease. So somebody gets admitted with hospitalization, The average cost is around 60,000 rupees just for one admitted, right? And then it doesn't end there. You get followed up. You can get readmitted. There are costs of medications. There are caregiver costs. So roughly, for about 2 years after you get admitted, if you don't have any comorbidities, you end up paying about 1.3 lakhs, right? If you have diabetes on the top, that becomes 2.6 lakhs. It's as simple as that. That's what diabetes does to just heart rate, right? Now think about, all of us know, and you're going to hear it again and again in every meeting about the SGLT2 inhibitors and heart rate, right? I'm using DAPA as an example. You have 19 patients were treated for 2 years, it's the NNT. One event of HHF or CHT is prevented. Now let's look at it from a system point of view. If you treat 19 patients for 2 years, the total cost for the system itself is around, and this is assuming the money, the cost that's there in the net, but mostly systems will generally be able to get discounts. Even patients get 20-30% discounts. If you treat 19 patients for 2 years, 20 patients for 2 years, at the most you're going to spend 1.8 lakhs. That's very interesting, right? Prevent a heart failure for one patient for 2 years. If 19 patients were treated for 2 years, one event is prevented, but you spend about 1.8 lakhs, right? But that's it. Now, if you look at it from an individual patient point, let's say it takes 10 years for him. The lowest cost of dapagliflozin available, and it's probably going to get lower. For 10 years for a patient, it's only 44,000 rupees. Where's 44,000 rupees? And where is, if you get heart failure, around 2.6 lakhs, 2 years. So the simplest thing to remember is it's much, much more easy and cost effective to prevent complications. So think about it that way. If you notice, I've given a financial theme to it. So most of us know that the first million is the hardest to make. But when you look at it, the money you invested in the first year actually compounds some more when you buy mutual funds and others, right? So let's look at this very interesting. I drew this from the UKPDS. This is not from a direct publication. I actually took up the values and directed. So you can use it freely, don't worry. So if you look at the mortality reduction, this is 15 years and this is 20 years. Overall, the mortality reduction in terms of cardiovascular mortality is about 22% at the end of 15 years, 27%, 23.5% at the end of 20 years. But if you were treated early and there was a 1% reduction in the A1C, right? Your mortality at 15 years was about 15%, and this is what is at 20%. On the other hand, if you're treated later, can you see the mortality benefit is already coming down? Similarly, a 1% reduction in A1C, early versus late, you will realize a significant benefit when in the first year you have brought down your A1C. Let's look at the cost to achieve a first year target when a patient's just come to you, right? If his A1C is around 7, you just need one drug, metformin, anywhere between 750 and 1600, depending on what you choose. From 7.5 to 6.5, a metformin plus DPP4, at the most, you're spending 4,200 to, at the higher end, 14,600 per year. 3 drugs, add a sulfonylurea, maybe glimepiride here, around 5,000 rupees. If you want to prescribe a very high price product, then 20,000. And let's say you put metformin, sulfonylurea, and insulin because your A1C was 9.5 or above at start, around 13,700. Now realize what you've done by an investment for anywhere between 750 rupees or 4,000 rupees or 5,000 rupees or 13,000 rupees. What you achieved is reducing the 20-year mortality by 25%. Imagine for a patient who's come in with 7 plus lifestyle changes. What you're really doing is helping this person live longer, isn't it? And Dr. Das is talking about Nachiketa. So you will live longer as long as you start in the first year. Those who start early live longer. Those when you invest early, you live longer. when patients come and tell you, look, I'm just a diabetic, why are you giving me so many drugs? I want to tell them that the first year is the most difficult year for you. And it's the first year that gives me the window of opportunity to help you. Let me make sure I am happy to back off later, but for the first 2 to 3 years, I'm going to hit you hard with the drugs that I have. The third one is, again, for those of you who invest, remember that it's not a question of just the interest, the interest compound. We saw an example of that earlier, but look at this. This is a new CVD equation, right? A 1 millimole reduction in LDL gives you prevents 8 events. 4 millimeters systolic blood pressure lowering prevents 12 events. Similarly with PIO and empagliflozin, right? I want you to remember you have a very old study, very small study, but it has a big heart. This is the Steno study. Only 160 patients were randomized at 1993. At the end of it, you had only 42 patients to look at it completely in the intensive treatment arm and 24 in the conventional arm. And in fact, it was not as intense as we thought. We now think about. Remember, it was done in 1993. These patients were told to get a lower blood pressure initially, then a lower diastolic blood pressure also, and then they said your A1C should be around 6.5. Your fasting, they looked at total cholesterol less than 175. Triglyceride to be less than 150. We treated with an ACE inhibitor and aspirin. That's really all that they talked about. And then look at what happened. This is at 59 months of follow-up. This is at 96 months of follow-up. And you can see the curves are separating. It's like as if the interest is compounding. This is when it was again published in 2018, looking at around 13 years of follow-up. And then at 21 years, you are seeing that at the end of 7 years, remember that not much, that they were let to be the same. It was just follow-up. Nothing active was done. But you would realize that you had indeed become what Nachiketa wanted. About 8 years more to life was gained at 21 years. The all-cause mortality was down. CV mortality was down. CVD events were down. Retinopathy progression, autonomic neuropathy, peripheral neuropathy, microalbumin all came down by just using the drugs that we talked about in the beginning. And what is the cost? Per year, the cost to add 2 antihypertensives, because one is usually not enough, is around 600 to 6,000. So roughly about 1,000 rupees. Just take it there. For a 30% reduction, you need either 20 milligrams of atorvastatin or 10 milligrams or 10 milligrams of rosuvastatin. The lowest is around 876 rupees per year, but 47 rupees for the aspirin, and anywhere between 1,500 and 10,000, depending on the brand you prescribe. You have already done one year's worth of Steno, and all you have to do is continue for 7 years. So which means 620 into 7, 876 into 7, 47 into 7, and 1,500 into 7. And roughly around 10,000 rupees or 15,000 rupees. You brought this person 21%, 8 years of life more. Where will you get this kind of return for investment? This is beautiful investment, right? And all doing the right things. So first, we said it is cost-effective to prevent complications. I gave you an example of the heart study. Invest in the first year, I gave you the example of the UKPBS. Told you how small investments compound. I gave you the example of Steno. I want to take you close to how you can do risk management. And everyone thinks only a diabetologist or an endocrinologist can do this, but this can be done in primary care. This is the Barry study. Just to tell you, before I go there, that the relationship between the number of risk factors and heart disease, MI, and stroke. The greater the number of risk factors, right, the greater the risk of MI and stroke. And if you control these at the end of, let's say, 5 years, right, then your risk of stroke comes down and heart comes down very, very well. I told you the cost of this, and this. Just to let you know, this particular patient was smoking, right, around 5 cigarettes per day. That's 1/4 of a pack per day. The cost of 10 cigarettes in India is anywhere between 100 rupees and 400 rupees per day. 10 cigarettes. So this patient was taking 5 cigarettes. He was really spending 18,000 rupees on just cigarettes alone. Something that could have been a small recurring deposit, something that can pay for his entire care, right? And something that is going to negate all the other good things that we do for him. So just by asking him to reduce his smoking and stop it, we are actually saving him life, saving him money, and allowing better care. So in Hong Kong, what they did was in 2009, and this is much before the SGLT2 inhibitors were there. They looked at empowering primary care physicians with risk-based management protocols. And what they showed was that when you did that, and this is the only study that looked at cost benefit from outcomes rather than surrogate markers, they showed that there was improvement just by risk-based management in heart disease and heart failure. And can you see the upper limit of confidence interval in stroke, in retinopathy? Not so much. In nephropathy and neuropathy, but ESRD and standard treatment for retinopathy, all of this came down. Interestingly, there was a reduction in all-cause mortality. More importantly, remember that what happens to diabetics is when they get hospitalized, their money gets drained. They go to the emergency room multiple number of times. They visit doctors more often. All of this came down. And it saved the healthcare system a lot of money. This is the amount of cost that was there, but what it did was it avoided complications. Look at the risk reduction in complications. The NNT for CVD was just 9 people had to be on it. For acute myocardial infarction, 30. For heart failure, 21. Realize that this is the cost when you do risk-based management. It's the same benefit of adding dapagliflozin, right? Remember, the NNT for heart failure for dapagliflozin was 21. None of the drugs that we give have this. Really, you really want to be doing risk-based management. Stroke was 30, ESRD was 28, all-cause death. You treated 7 people on a risk-based management. Very simple protocols. It came down. So first, cost effectiveness is to prevent complications. Second, first here is the most crucial. Third, do small things. Blood pressure, weight, cholesterol. Fourth, protocolize and use right protocols for high-risk patients. Next is to cut the frills. A lot of our patients demand and get put on these things. Multivitamins, vitamin E, antioxidants, some of them on things like protein powders, protein extractants, biscuits, ensures, any other kind of supplement. I'm sorry to sound very bad. I have lots of friends in the nutraceutical industry. I'd love to be friends with them. But most of these products don't belong in a diabetes prescription, at least in the outpatient. If you want to use portion controls, that's different, or portion substitutions, that's different. But none of these belong in a diabetes prescription. That is money that can be spent on legitimate drugs, legitimate interventions to help patients. So my fifth point is cut frills. I don't want to spend time on the next one, but if you treat patients, if you empower them, if you educate them, help them understand how to use insulin, help them how to take care of their food, teach them how to use calories, how to eat less. Remember, eating less is the only way that to prolong life. Lastly, to tell you that what is most cost effective when you follow evidence. Evidence-based care is the most cost effective. This is a look at the ADA guidelines and looking at what is cost effective. You will see that diabetes self-management is cost effective. Self-monitoring of glucose among insulin is cost effective. Intensive control among newly diagnosed type 2D, which I talked about, is cost effective. ACE and ARB is cost effective. Multi-component interventions are cost effective. Smoking cessation is cost effective. Foot care is cost effective. Screening for eye complications is cost effective. Statin therapy is cost effective. Right? Clearly, what is cost effective is doing the right thing for patients. So let's go back to this patient. What was done? Was started on DPP4 inhibitor, metformin, statin, ART. All cost effective. Was educated on lifestyle, and he quit smoking. The multivitamin was stopped. This was the cost of his evidence-based care. He was on 2 drugs, so he spent around between 4,000. So let's say he had 6,000 rupees for this. He was put on another 700, let's say, for the 2 antihypertensive, another 900 for the statin. Paid over 50 rupees per year for aspirin. So his basic total cost per year was around 1,700 rupees. He also got blood tests 3 times, around 900 for the HbA1c 3 times a year. An annual lipid profile, it was 400. A urine albumin creatinine ratio was 375. A fundus photograph, a creatinine that's 100 rupees, a foot exam that can be 250 rupees depending on 3 or 4 doctor visits at 1,000 rupees total. And education cost with the nutritionist, it was around 500, maybe 2 or 3 times a year. And what happened at the end of the year? His A1C was 6.5. His LDL was less than 100. His BP is 138. His first year's cost of care was around 8,700 rupees. But remember that he saved another 18,000 rupees by stopping smoking and 700 rupees by stopping supplements. He started putting that money into his children's welfare fund. And he looked forward to life. So let me complete. What is the most cost-effective way to practice medicine? To do the most appropriate thing first. And it's to do the most appropriate thing always. Think about doing the right thing for the patient, and there is always a way. Cost is just a barrier in our mind. Most of our patients, we don't live in a poor, dirty, indigent India. We live in a hardworking, collaborative, growing, caring India, where if you want to take care of patients, there is always a way. Thank you so much for your patience. I hope you like this.
Thank you very much. And it's an original presentation which is rare to find, and you have given beautiful way developing the story. And Dr. Abdul, today morning, Krishna sent me a message. Ashok, he calls me, sir, I want to develop it as a narrative. I said, yes, we will develop a narrative for the entire country. I have only few questions to ask you to complete your presentation. I just wanted to ask you, it has been said that diabetes cuts down the life, type 2 diabetes by 10 years and type 1 by about 15 or 20 years. And people say that diabetes is a vascular disease. You are as old as your arteries. If you do not take care of diabetes control, as you rightly pointed out, you grow earlier, and maybe at 50 you look like 60. The message you have given is absolutely fabulous. So, what are the 3 most important things that one should look forward to? I will summarize: medication. Number 2, as you rightly said about the education, and third is the optimal control of the multiple factors. What will be your message to the people sitting in front of you? How they can, of course, you have given the message. I'm just asking it again, Krishna. What did you say that obesity? What are the things that cuts down the life of a type 2 diabetic? It is inbuilt. It is built in your presentation, but to make it more evident. What would you like to say?
So, if at all I have learned anything, I have learned that the doctors should be harbingers of hope.
Hope, absolutely.
When patients come to us, they come with the baggage, all right, but they also come with the feeling that baggage cannot be lightened, right? They have obesity. Yes, they have all the trappings that cuts down life, that cuts down inflammation. But as we talk about in translational medicine circles, that even the beta cells wait like a faithful spouse for you to turn out into a newer leaf. So not all is lost when the patient comes to you.
Absolutely.
So the first thing is, as Dr. Vishwanathan would say, inculcate in the patients a sense of discipline that diabetic does. When you're a diabetic, it does inculcate a sense of discipline. You learn to eat less. You learn to change your lifestyle. You learn to make, you turn over a new leaf, right? By reducing, for example, we know that caloric reduction prolongs life. At least
I think if you eat less, you live longer. I think, absolutely.
That is the first message.
Yeah.
The second, invest earlier and harder.
Yeah. I think this is
crucial.
Krishna, is it not the same which was shown in UKPDS in addition to what you showed in the steno trials? Is it the legacy effect which carries on if the first year control, early aggressive control is going to pay you much dividend? Am I correct, Krishna?
Absolutely. It is like no. That's why I gave this thing about investing. No, when you invest, it compounds, right? So the benefits just separate out, and you can see that beautiful thing that happens. I think doctors need to spend more time telling patients, look, I can help you beat the odds. You need to take that form of a coach and motivate them and say, look, you can do this. Don't get worried about it. Cost is never a concern.
Yeah.
India is wonderful because we have the ability to cut down the cost. All it requires for you to be very faithful to the drugs, stick to a plan,
absolutely.
Learn how to take charge of your life, but move forward. You have not been given a death knell, you have only been given a reminder to become better.
Yeah. Do you believe in this saying, Krishna, before we have 3 minutes more, believe in the saying that a non-diabetic who is well controlled, well monitored is sometimes better than a non-diabetic? I think that's what the message you are giving. It also said rightly, a full life despite diabetes, a full, dignified, decent life despite diabetes is possible.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's why I was quoting Dr. Vishwanathan, because I think he was the one who started this, and Dr. Mohan keeps talking about it. And I really appreciate it because it gives you an opportunity or a bellwether for you to change yourself. And the thing is that it gives when doctors become, if you take pregnancy, you see patients listen to you, because what you're giving to patients in pregnancy is not fear, you're giving them hope. I think it's the same thing. You give them the hope, you tell them that this is not impossible.
Absolutely.
But I am there to support you. Let's do this together. I think that is my message.
Fantastic. And before I close, I'll just go back to what you really said, and it is built in this year's IDF's message. And also it is important, Krishna, that it's also important how soon a patient receives the correct diagnosis. That means you rightly said about the screening. I like the thing you showed, that the cost-effective care and all the points, the bullet points that to the left, which are very cost-effective. And you showed the benefit of screening. So it is the access to a correct diagnosis early on, then losing time. And number two, access to treatment. And access to treatment, as you rightly said, is great. Before I close again, Krishna, I'll tell you, this year's NIS, I have a theme lecture. And my theme lecture is Insulin India, a privilege or a right? I'm going to say insulin is a right of everybody. I think Abdul, my dear friend, will agree beyond anybody else. At the same time, insulin in our country is also a privilege. We get it at a lower price. It is Mark Evans who said, there is a value which is beyond price. We must all try. Government of India tries to bring down the price. So it is a value which is above price. And absolutely treating diabetes appropriately is very cost effective, because the cost is in complications. And I cannot thank you, Krishna, more. I am aware that you finished the presentation night 2:30, early morning today, and your effort has not gone in vain. It has enriched all of us. A big hand for Krishna. Thank you very, very much. Thank you very, very much. Dear friends, I'll now pass on to the next talk. And here I have in front of me Dr. Rajesh Rajput. Can I have his biodata coming here? Dear friends, we have wonderful treatment for type 2 diabetes. But all three treatments are plagued by two things. One is hypoglycemia, and other one is weight gain. But there is also some challenging treatment, advanced treatment, which do not produce hypoglycemia, do not produce weight gain. At the same time, it acts in a very different manner to the urinary excretion of glucose, and giving rise is an insulin independent action. And believe me, dear friends, this particular molecule has been hailed as the molecule of the decade. And dear friends, I have with me Dr. Rajesh Rajput, my very close and our very close and dear friend in front of us. I will not read his biodata, his MBBS, MD, DM, and fellowship of all the societies in the world, more than 100 publications, a great communicator, written monograms and books. And I have heard him many times in various forums under this wonderful molecule, dapagliflozin, which I call the molecule of the decade. And he's going to show us in his presentation how this molecule is very important, is contemporary, and how it has to be used or what has to be done about this molecule. And I will leave it entirely to Rajesh to discuss this molecule. But dear friends, before I end, I'll just give a small example. We didn't have treatment for hypertension, treatment for tuberculosis. We lost to an American president because TB treatment was not available. But the other American treatment, other president of America, we lost because of hypertension. When hypertension treatment was available and people were debating whether hypertension treated or not to be treated. The debate was going on, and because of hypertension, he had cerebral hemorrhage. So he's going to speak to us about this wonderful molecule, the molecule of the decade, and position it in current diabetes scenario. Rajesh, please take over.
Thank you, Dr. Das. I'm audible and slides are visible?
Yes, very much.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. At the onset, I like to thank medical team, Micro Labs, for inviting me this year Prendos program. Although we used to meet in physical, but view of COVID, we are doing it virtually. And as Dr. Das has told you, I am going to discuss about SGLT2 inhibitors, especially with focus on dapagliflozin. Now I will start with a case. Mr. X, who is a corporate executive, is a non-smoker, 45 years of age, diagnosed with type 2 diabetes from last 2 years, also having hypertension from last 6 years. Patient was receiving metformin 1 gram twice a day with telmisartan 40 milligrams once a day. His current HbA1c is 8.8%. He is obese with a BMI of 28 kg per square meter body surface area. This is obesity as per Asian guidelines, not as per Caucasian guidelines. Some of you must be thinking why I am saying obese, because in Caucasian guideline it is 30. And the question is, what should be our approach? Reduction of fasting plasma glucose, postprandial glucose, so as to achieve HbA1c, minimizing the risk of hypoglycemia, losing the body weight. How to calculate CVD risk in this patient? Is it worth calculating in a patient who is having type 2 diabetes from last 2 years? So these are some of the things which often comes to the mind when such patients comes to us in routine clinical practice. So I will build my lecture based on this background patient, where we have to now give him the medication to control his glucose, taking into account his busy schedule to minimize the risk of hypoglycemia, allowing him to lose some body weight. And obviously, at the same time, we have to reduce or we have to minimize cardiometabolic risks. So let's see how we can do this. Now, I do not know how many of you actually remember it. Presently, China is the world capital for diabetes, and India is behind China at place number 2. But if you see the projections given in IDF Atlas, by 2045, India is actually going to the diabetes capital of world. And at that point of time, China will be way behind our country. Now, this is not a point to boast or point to say that we have done something good. So why this is happening? Now, this is happening because of typical Indian phenotype which our population is having. If you see, we are having more insulin resistance at the same body mass index. We are having higher inflammation as assessed by measuring CRP level. We have higher waist circumference and greater abdominal adiposity, although we are apparently looking healthy. So this gives a concept of thin, fat Indian phenotypes. And that is why I have said the patient in question, even at a BMI of 28 with the guidelines, is now an obese individual. We also having a lower level of adiponectin. Indians have a characteristic dyslipidemia. They have high triglyceride, low HDL, and high small dense LDL. And because of all these abnormal metabolic milieu, Asians, Indians are at increased susceptibility to develop type 2 diabetes at least a decade earlier as compared to our Caucasian counterpart, and not only at increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes, also at an increased risk of developing various cardiorenal complications. This is one of the recent publications done by some of our colleagues from our own country, where they have shown that at least 67% of the Indian patients are not achieving their HbA1c target despite availability of number of drugs, in contrast to the era when we were students, when hardly 2 drugs are available. Despite availability of so many drugs, 67% of the patients are not able to achieve target. And I tell you, this is quite promising number. We have seen even more, this number is probably more higher if we involve studies involving more rural, more interior parts of the country, where even less than 10% of the patients are actually achieving their HbA1c of less than 7%. But then if their patients are not achieving, what is the harm? We know about the association between microvascular complications and not able to achieve HbA1c less than 7%. But this is a recent publication which is about association of achieving early glycemic control. That Krishna is saying, invest in first year after diagnosis. And this study highlights the same concept, that delay in intensification by 1 year in conjunction with poor glycemic control increases the risk of myocardial infarction, heart failure, stroke, and composite cardiovascular event. And this is done from a large retrospective cohort involving more than lakhs of patients of type 2 diabetes. And see what are the results. If you are not intensifying your treatment within first year, not bringing your patient to less than 7% within first year, the result is more than 67% risk of myocardial infarction, more than 51% increased risk of stroke, more than 64% risk of heart failure, and more than 62% risk of composite cardiovascular events. So it is not only micro, but macrovascular complications also become more if we are not intensifying our treatment within first year. Also, when it comes to diabetes, often there are talks about calculating risk using various risk calculator. I think there is no need to use any risk calculator in a patient of diabetes, because patients of diabetes, there is nothing like low or no risk. And based on the data which has accumulated over last 2 decades, in 2019, in European Society of Cardiology guidelines, this concept is given, which is more practical and applied clinically at when you are seeing your patients. Patients who are young with diabetes, that is type 1 diabetes less than 35 years of age, type 2 diabetes less than 50 years of age, diabetes duration less than 10 years, and no other risk factor, the patient which we are discussing at the beginning of the lecture, they are also at a moderate risk, considering the concept that having diabetes is equivalent to 1 myocardial infarction. In contrast, if you have a diabetes duration of more than 10 years with no target organ damage and any additional risk factor like hypertension, dyslipidemia, obesity, you are at high risk for future cardiovascular risk. And if you have a diabetes with established CVD, or if you have more than or equal to 3 major risk factors, which are again hypertension, dyslipidemia, smoking, obesity, commonly calculated or present risk factor. And if you have early onset type 1 diabetes with now duration more than 20 years, you are at a very high risk. Tell me, with this classification, where is a need to have any calculator? You simply need to know the duration of diabetes. You simply need to know the common risk factors, which we otherwise note down. And we simply need to know whether there is presence of any target organ damage or not. We can classify our patient into moderate, high, and very high risk. But always remember, there is nothing like low risk or no risk for type 2 diabetes. And that is why we have to be aggressive in our approach to control diabetes right from day one. There is no concept that it is a beginning of diabetes, we can wait for a few years. If we lose initial few years, we are actually missing the right opportunity. Now let's come to the management of diabetes. What is the goal for management of type 2 diabetes? To manage hyperglycemia? I think the answer is no. Apart from managing hyperglycemia, the goal of managing type 2 diabetes is also to prevent cardiorenal metabolic complication. And how we can achieve this? We have to rethink the approach of managing type 2 diabetes. When we see a patient of type 2 diabetes, there are short-term goals and there are long-term goals. The short-term goals are achieving fasting plasma glucose, postprandial glucose, and HbA1c, and achieving them at a safety. What is the safety? Minimizing hypoglycemia, minimizing weight gain, in fact, losing weight, and minimizing other side effects. At the same time, if we manage successfully the comorbidities which are commonly present in patients of type 2 diabetes, that is hypertension, dyslipidemia, and obesity, then only we are able to achieve our long-term goal, which is sustained glycemic control, reducing cardiovascular risk, reducing progression of nephropathy. So this is the way we should think when we see a patient of type 2 diabetes in our clinical practice. The next question is, what is an ideal drug for treatment of type 2 diabetes? The ideal drug should control both fasting and postprandial, should have 24-hour duration of action, should do glucose-dependent insulin secretion, suppresses glucagon, should be free of risk of hypoglycemia, should be weight neutral, should have sustainable effect on dysglycemia, should be CV safe, should provide cardiorenal protection. Do we have a single drug? The answer is probably no. We have to use combination, and we have learned from De Fronzo lecture that diabetes is a defect of number of defects, at least 8 different defects. And in today's era, there is a role for polypharmacy with using right number of drugs right from day one in patients of diabetes. Now, this is another wonderful piece of information. I do not know how many of you have seen this information published in Endocrine and Diabetologia, that what is a residual vascular risk after intensive glycemic control in type 2 diabetes patient with conventionally available drug, that is before availability of DPP4, GLP-1 receptor agonist, and SGLT2 inhibitors. So if you see on heart failure, with the use of conventionally available anti-diabetic agents, the risk removed is 0% and the residual risk is 100%. If we see MACE, which is 3-point MACE, the risk removed is only 9% and the residual risk is 91%. If you see stroke, the residual risk is 96%. For myocardial infarction, the residual risk is 85%. Even for microvascular disease like neuropathy, nephropathy, and retinopathy, there is considerable residual risk, which means we need better drugs. We need drugs which does not only control glucose, but at the same time reduce your cardiorenal metabolic risk. Only then we can reduce this residual risk in our patients of type 2 diabetes. So this brings me to the point in discussion today that I am going to discuss briefly about SGLT2 inhibitors. Now, how SGLT2 inhibitor fits into the therapeutic armamentarium for treatment of type 2 diabetes. Now, you know, it is French chemists who have isolated fluorescein, which is a non-specific SGLT2 inhibitor, in 1835 from barks of apple tree. And it takes more than 100 years before this molecule is now available for clinical use. Now, question is, can SGLT2 inhibitors addresses the current limitation of diabetes management in terms of better and durable glycemic control, pleiotropic benefit of reduction in other cardiovascular risk factor, and cardiorenal risk reduction? If we see, and now all of us are using SGLT2 inhibitors for more than 7 years. Originally, obviously, they are developed to lower glucose level by inducing glucosuria. But over last few years, a large amount of evidence from CVOT trial as well as real-world evidence studies have shown that they have considerable cardiovascular and renal protective benefits. And these results have transformed the way SGLT2 inhibitors are now used or should be used in patients of diabetes. Apart from inducing glucose excretion into the urine, which on an average is reduced, they are inducing 60 to 80 grams of glucose into the urine. And always remember, one molecule of glucose is equivalent to 4 millimole, which is equivalent to 240 to 320 kilocalories of energy. So patient have an additional weight loss. What has been shown that the amount of weight, which is although appearing small, is happening because of primary change in loss of fat, and reduction in body fats are maintained for as long as now we have evidence for up to 5 years. Now, how SGLT2 are happening or reducing cardiometabolic risk? There are lots of mechanisms, and our colleagues often ask that they are inducing glucosuria, so they are like diuretics. But there is a definite difference between diuretics and SGLT2 inhibitors. What are the differences? SGLT2 inhibitors induces glucoresis. Now, by doing so, they are changing the important hemodynamic parameters. If you see the difference between diuretic and SGLT2, the amount of volume lost with diuretics is intravascular volume. In contrast, the 2/3 of the volume lost through SGLT2 inhibitor is interstitial fluid volume. If you see the effect on uric acid, it tends to rise with use of diuretics. However, there is a beneficial decrease in serum uric acid with use of SGLT2 inhibitor. With use of diuretics, there is stimulation of sympathetic nervous system, which is not good for patients of diabetes. With SGLT2 inhibitor, SNS is not stimulated. With use of diuretics, there is problem of electrolytes imbalance. This issue is not seen with SGLT2 inhibitor. So friends, SGLT2 inhibitors are more than diuretics. Apart from that, there are a number of novel mechanisms, which I am not going to dwell in detail because of the time limitation, but there is a fuel shift. They promotes generation of small amounts of ketone, which is considered as a super fuel for human body. There is a concept of sodium hydrogen exchanger, the type 1, which is expressed on kidney, the type 3, which is expressed on the cardiac muscle, and through beneficial effect on sodium hydrogen exchanger, they provide both cardio-renal benefits. They have a preferential effect on interstitial volume, as I have told you. They do cardiac remodeling, reduces your epicardial fat. They have a beneficial effect on heme oxygenase, increases your hematocrit, and thereby improving the oxygen delivery to the target. So there are numerous mechanisms through which SGLT2 inhibitors are beneficial. Now that brings me to some of the landmark cardio-renal outcome trials. I am going to discuss in brief about 3 important trials, that is DECLARE TIMI 58, DAPA-HF, and DAPA-CKD trial. If you say DECLARE TIMI 58, it is published in NEJM in 2018, dapagliflozin and cardiovascular outcome in type 2 diabetes. Now, again, this is a randomized multicentric trial done in more than 17,000 patients of type 2 diabetes who either have an established cardiovascular disease or they are having multiple risk factors. Now, 2/3 of the population enrolled were only having multiple risk factors, that is patients which we are seeing in routine clinical practice. They are randomized in 1:1 fashion to receive either dapagliflozin 10 milligram or placebo. This is an event-driven trial with more than 1,390 MACE events to be captured during this trial, with a median follow-up of 4.2 years, and the primary endpoint is composite of CVD or hospitalization for heart failure and MACE. What are the results of this trial? This trial has shown that composite of CVD and MACE is reduced by a superiority margin by of 17% with a significant p-value. If we see MACE in particular, that is composite of reduction in CV death, non-fatal MI, and non-fatal stroke, it shows non-inferiority reduced by a margin of around 7% and failed to show superiority. Now, there are a number of secondary endpoints in this trial, but the important one was renal composite, which include reduction in eGFR by 40%, ESRD, renal or CV death. And as you see clearly, again, there's a beneficial 24% reduction with significant p-value and a reduction in all-cause mortality, which again failed to show statistical significance. Now, based on the results of this trial, where heart failure is reduced significantly, renal composite endpoints are reduced significantly, this gives an insight that whether these drugs are beneficial in these patients or not. Before we go into that, in DECLARE-TIMI 58, they have done a subgroup analysis where they tried to find out whether the effect is seen in patients who have baseline heart failure or not, effect on baseline GFR, and whether patients are having multiple risk factors or ASCVD. As you see clearly, the 3-point MACE or CVD and HHF is more beneficial in those who are having established cardiovascular disease. However, the benefit is seen irrespective of the fact whether you are having heart failure at baseline or not. And again, as eGFR is less than 60, the beneficial effect is observed irrespective of the fact whether it is less than up to 30 or whether it is less than 60. Also, if we see, depending on the baseline characteristic in those patients, whether they are having multiple risk factor or established ASCVD, DECLARE-TIMI 58 is a first CV outcome study which have shown that in patients of type 2 diabetes who are only having risk factors for future cardiovascular disease, you have beneficial effects in reduction in hospitalization for heart failure. You have reduction in renal composite endpoints, and you have reduction in renal specific endpoints. So definitely there are important messages from DECLARE-TIMI 58, and based on DECLARE-TIMI 58, Subodh Verma has given this beautiful concept that if you use a dapagliflozin 10 milligram versus placebo, if your patient is having myocardial infarction less than 2 years, you are going to reduce significantly your MACE events. And the number needed to treat for 4 years is only 38. But in patients who are only having risk factors, probably the MACE benefit is not seen with the dapagliflozin in a trial which is followed up to 4 years. And when we follow probably these years for a longer period of time, even this benefit might also be seen. However, when it comes to reduction in CVD or hospitalization for heart failure, irrespective of the fact whether patient is having cardiovascular disease or not, or patient is having only risk factor, the beneficial effect of dapagliflozin is observed with number needed to treat 53. Same is a benefit on renal outcome. Whether you are having an established CVD or only risk factor, renal benefits with dapagliflozin are observed in DECLARE-TIMI 58. Now let's discuss the next trial, which is DAPA-HF trial. That is dapagliflozin in patients with heart failure and reduced ejection fraction. Now again, in this trial, this is again trial involving more than 20 countries with more than 4,700 patients. The inclusion criteria for this trial is patients were in NYHA class 2 to 4 with LVEF less than or equal to 40% and N-terminal pro-BNP more than or equal to 600. Patients are randomized in 1:1 fashion to receive either dapagliflozin or placebo. And the results of this trial shows that the primary outcome, which is cardiovascular death, hospitalization for heart failure, or urgent heart failure hospital visits, they are reduced significantly by 26%, with reaching superiority with a significant p-value. If we see secondary endpoints, the CV death is also showing superiority and is reduced by around 18%. If we see worsening of renal function, again, it shows a reduction. However, it failed to show superiority. In DAPA-HF, it has been shown that there is a 26% reduction which was significant and in favor of dapagliflozin. Another important message from dapagliflozin is that patients were divided based on presence or absence of diabetes. And it has been shown that dapagliflozin prevents worsening of heart failure or CV death irrespective of baseline glucose status, which means it is effective even in patients without diabetes. If we see the hazard ratio in patients without diabetes, it is 0.73, while in patients with diabetes, the hazard ratio for benefit is 0.75. Now, based on these results, it was concluded that in patients of heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, dapagliflozin lowers the risk of heart failure or death. And based on results, US FDA has approved dapagliflozin to reduce the risk of CVD and HF in patients with heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, irrespective of the fact whether patient is having diabetes or no diabetes. Now, important point which you are going to ask probably at the end of the lecture, there is also Emperor reduced trial. What is the difference between DAPA-HF and Emperor reduced? I have tried to summarize some differences between the two trials. If you see the reduction in hospitalization for heart failure, it is almost identical between two. But the difference lies if you see the reduction in CV death, which is 18% reaching superiority with dapagliflozin in DAPA-HF. However, it is only 8% in empagliflozin and failed to show superiority. If you see the effects on all-cause death or all-cause mortality, it is again reduced by 17%, reaching a p-value of superiority in DAPA-HF with dapagliflozin, but not showing same benefit with empagliflozin. Another important observation with DAPA-HF is that in pre-diabetic population, there is a reduction in progression to new onset diabetes by 32%, in contrast to 14% reduction with empagliflozin in Emperor reduced trial. So there are subtle differences between the two trials in the results, which I have tried to highlight in this for the benefit of all of you. Lastly, the third important trial with dapagliflozin, that is DAPA-CKD, dapagliflozin in patients with chronic kidney disease. Now, if we see again, this is multicentric, multi-country trial. Patients are randomized in 1:1 fashion to receive dapagliflozin or placebo. We should carefully remember the inclusion criteria. Patients of more than 18 years with eGFR between 25 to 75, with urinary albumin creatinine ratio between 200 to 5,000, and patients are already receiving maximally tolerated doses of ACE or ARBs. Patients of type 1 diabetes, those having polycystic kidney disease, lupus nephritis, ANCA-associated vasculitis were excluded from this trial. What were the results? The results are composite primary, which is sustained more than or equal to 50% eGFR reduction, progression to ESRD, death from renal or CV cause. It is reduced by numerically 39%, which reaches a p-value of superiority. And if we see the renal specific composite endpoint, again, they are reduced significantly, showing a p-value for superiority. So again, highlighting that with use of dapagliflozin in patients of CKD, there is reduction in renal composite endpoints and renal specific endpoints. And this benefit is shown irrespective of presence or absence of type 2 diabetes. If you see the subgroup analysis, if you see the subgroup analysis, the benefits are shown on the top of ACE and ARBs. And then the next publication in Lancet have shown that even in those patients who are having chronic glomerulonephritis, ischemic or hypertensive chronic kidney disease, the benefit with dapagliflozin is shown. And based on this benefit, dapagliflozin earns the breakthrough therapy designation for CKD. So based on three important CV outcome trials, what are the recent recommendations? If you see ACE recommendation, where we divide patient based on baseline HbA1c, SGLT2 is now figuring with GLP-1 receptor agonist at the top to be chosen among one of the therapies. If we see European Society of Cardiology, in patients who are type 2 diabetes, drug naive, in those even before metformin, we can initiate SGLT2 inhibitor. And DCGI in July 3/2020 have given approval to dapagliflozin for use in adults patient with heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. NICE guidelines specifically recommend again in same indication dapagliflozin. And now in 2021, ADA recommendations clearly recommend that in patients who are having ASCVD at high risk, we have to choose SGLT2 or GLP-1. But those who are having heart failure or CKD, clearly SGLT2 inhibitor scores over GLP-1 receptor agonist with dapagliflozin as a molecule, which we are discussing here. To summarize, SGLT2 inhibitors have become an indispensable part of therapeutic armamentarium in type 2 diabetes. They improve cardiovascular and renal outcome. And SGLT2 have steadily gained importance in numerous recommendations. So the new mantra for successful and effective treatment of type 2 diabetes is prescribe SGLT2 inhibitor, protect heart and kidneys, and save lives. Thank you very much.
I think, Rajesh, you have given a very, very, very descriptive and very panoramic view of the molecule, which is really held as the molecule of the decade. I mean, no, you have not left anything untouched. It affects the entire CRM, the cardiac, renal, and the metabolic angle. You told about the weight loss. Maybe you touched a little bit about its effect on the NASH and its effect on the many aspects that type 2 diabetes needs. I have only 3 questions, but I want only one sentence answer, Rajesh. Would you use SGLT2 in post-operative CVD patients? Just a single sentence answer.
The drug is to be used once patients are hemodynamically stable. Okay, any patient with cardiovascular disease whose blood pressure is not controllable or hemodynamically unstable, please avoid. At the time of discharge in hemodynamically stable patient, start SGLT2 inhibitors.
Fantastic. Second question. I mean, if you're going to prescribe SGLT to a patient, what are your communication, viscerometabolic communication you like?
If I'm going to prescribe SGLT2 inhibitor, first of all, please note down, always calculate eGFR, and you have to decide your priority for which you are using SGLT2 inhibitor. If you are using SGLT2 inhibitor for glucose control, it becomes most effective when your eGFR is more than 60 ml. But if you are using for reducing cardio-renal benefits, as we have discussed in outcome trial, then you can use your SGLT2 inhibitor up to eGFR of 30. Also, discuss the patient the risk of genital infections and urinary tract infections. And always assure them that these are easy to control, but you have to watch for this. And if this happens, kindly come back. We will do it appropriately. Lastly, in elderly patients, always discuss about maintaining adequate volume intake. These are the 3 important communications.
Absolutely. I think absolutely fabulous answer. I think, Rajesh, there's one question. Somebody who has got 1 or 2 incidents of urinary tract infection. Would you recommend this drug for prevention or treatment of CKD?
Right. So if patient has not used SGLT2 inhibitor in past, that is SGLT2 inhibitor naive patient, and they have urinary tract infections in the past, they always can be given a trial for SGLT2 inhibitor. And if they tolerate, continue with it. But in contrast, if a patient develop urinary tract infection while on SGLT2 inhibitor, probably then it become imperative to withdraw them, and large number of them does not tolerate this drug.
I think last, for the benefit of the people present here, I'm borrowing 1 minute from Mala's time, Rajesh. Just tell to the audience, for the uninitiated audience, like Rajesh, uninitiated audience, what is the current guideline for the use of, you told that beautifully, but for the uninitiated, current guideline for the SGLT2 in type 2 diabetes? And you have 1 minute.
If I have to tell in one line, all patients of type 2 diabetes should be given benefit of SGLT2 inhibitor. But patients who require weight loss, patients, sir. Patient where there is a risk of hypoglycemia.
I was asking you a differentiation between. You said that for the Indians, I like that discussion that we do not need this calculation by ethnicity and by experience, by Asian. I think. But you said that the positioning of this drug today can be before metformin. I just want a little bit of explanation. Those who have severe risk factors, those who have ASCVD, or where do you treat it before?
Exactly. If we see a patient who is having an established cardiovascular disease or renal disease, and he's coming for the first time to us, I will like to use the SGLT2 inhibitor even before prescribing metformin. But if a patient is already on metformin, then I will continue with metformin and will add SGLT2 inhibitors.
Fantastic. I think Rajesh, you have given a very clear description. Thank you very, very much. And you know, I just end before I invite Vagesh, Professor Vagesh Iyer. I'll just tell you that you have told the beautiful thing about the gap between the innovation and the adoption. I think we have to work for it. And because the drug has become very, very affordable, we have to work, as I said about the American president, we have to spread the message. It is available, it is affordable, it is accessible, it is appropriate. Thank you very much, Rajesh, for this great talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Vagesh, you'll be having a full time. We pass on to a very, very important topic now. Now, we all are hearing about complications from Krishna to Rajesh. Here is a gentleman, a professor of, and sometime back the head. Currently, he has given the headship to somebody else. Now, from the Vagesh Iyer, from the St. John's Medical College, to speak to us on a very important topic on revealing, postponing, and preventing diabetes complications. What do I do? How do I do it? And Vagesh is going to speak about it. I will not take time to introduce him. You know, he is one of the DNB in Endo, and well decorated, a professor of the professors, and long research papers, a great clinician. I will not take time to introduce. Rather, I will ask Vagesh to start his presentation. Vagesh, all is yours.
Okay. Thank you, sir. At the outset, thank you very much for inviting this. Professor Das is my examiner for IMD. I think I'll be ever grateful for him. And thank you, sir, for your nice words. So my job is, I think, partially done by Dr. Rajesh Rajput and also Dr. Krishna Seshadri. But only thing I'll take you, how that history of medication they reached, what was the history behind, what are the trials which involved to bring to this medication. So this is a common garden case, what we see in our day-to-day practice. 48-year-old, almost in peak of his profession, a venture capital manager in a HDFC bank, comes with history of a fatigue and a weakness from past 2 months. If you look into his history, he's a diabetic from 8 years on OADs that I'll be mentioning. He has got a hypertension. He has got a dyslipidemia. There is no history of any IHD or any allergic for any medication. But most important thing, family history of a diabetes and IHD in the father and hypertension in the mother, means put together, he has got all the possible risk factors from the genes. He is a smoker and occasional alcoholic and quite active because he's in peak of his profession. Currently, he is on metformin and glimepiride. That's the standard medication which has been prescribed across before newer medication came. He's on telmisartan, he's on atorvastatin, aspirin because of a strong family history of IHD. And if you look into his examination and investigation, I'll only be speaking on his important highlights. He's obese by Indian standards. He's uncontrolled glycemia, HbA1c is 7.4. For a young person, we want to keep it less than 6.5. There is mild derangement of his lipids. We want to keep it less than 70, preferably even up to 100. I may be okay, but less than 70 is a strict criteria. And mild derangement of the renal function, eGFR is 62. So with all these things, patient is on metformin and glimepiride. My primary aim is to prevent him from going for a complication, whether it's a cardiac, renal. That is the most important I'll be discussing in next 15 minutes. So we know that diabetes is a big global problem. It just increases in number. We wouldn't have been bothered. But when diabetes increases, proportionately the complications do increase. So patients with diabetes are at the increased risk of a stroke, 2 to 4-fold compared to the general population. And they are at a higher risk of a cardiovascular disease, also death from the cardiovascular disease. They are also increased risk of a diabetic neuropathy because diabetes is a leading cause of a non-traumatic lower extremity amputation, and diabetes is a leading cause of a end-stage renal disease requiring renal replacement or hemodialysis, and diabetes is a leading cause of a blindness in a working class between 20 to 74 years. Otherwise, even a cataract still remains the leading cause. So that's why all thought that when glucose is causing so much of abnormality, why can't we bring down the glucose to a normal level or a HbA1c of less than 7%, prevent these complications? That's how these major trials were taken: DCCT in type 1, UKPDS in type 2 diabetes, and with a good glycemic control, they could achieve a reduction in the microvascular complication, that is retinopathy, nephropathy, and the neuropathy, significantly. Just 1% drop in a HbA1c, there was a huge benefit in the microvascular complication. But what happened was, the major killer disease for a type 2 diabetic patient is a macrovascular disease. There was a trend, but there was no statistically significant reduction in the macrovascular complication, especially in patients with type 2 diabetes. So we all know that lowering of a HbA1c, there is a benefit to the microvascular complication. Death related to diabetes does come down, but it doesn't reduce the macrovascular complications significantly. Then the question raised, probably the macrovascular complication threshold for a glycemia reduction is much more than the what we are reducing for a microvascular complication. That's why probably we require a stricter glycemic target. And glycemia is only a part of the macrovascular complication. Probably we need to address other risk factors. To take the first part, to have a much stricter glycemic control, major trials started in the early 2000s and the results came around 2008. These were the ACCORD, ADVANCE, and VADT. They recruited patients who were more than 60 years of age, with 10 years of diabetes, with some amount of a risk factor like our patient, and tried to achieve a glycemia less than what they achieved in a UKPDS trial. Yes, in ACCORD, it was something closer to 6%. In ADVANCE, it was less than 6.5%. And the VADT, it was less than 6%. So they wanted to achieve a strict glycemic control in the normal range in a shorter duration of 3 to 6 months from the time the trial has started. But the results were astonishingly different. They found that when they tried to achieve strict glycemic control, there were no benefit, especially in ACCORD and the VADT. There was more deaths because of the intensive control compared to patients who were less intensively controlled. Then whole concept of a glycemic control and a reduction of a macrovascular complications was put to bigger question. Then they focused on the other things. Probably glycemia is not alone important. I think we need to address even the other risk factors. To study on this, we had a most important thing is, yes, we need to have a fewer complication with lesser glycemia, with lesser hypoglycemia, control of a cardiovascular risk factors, HbA1c at target, and avoiding the weight increase. With this plan, they approached dyslipidemia, hypertension, hyperglycemia, and also antiplatelet agents. And the trials were mainly the two things. That was a STENO trial, which started after the UKPDS trial, and initial report came in 2003, and the subsequent study came in 2008. That's the follow-up study of a STENO-2 study. But the results showed were really great. With the multifactorial intervention, not only addressing the glucose of a HbA1c of less than 6.5%, even the hypertension, dyslipidemia, appropriate antiplatelet usage, they found that patients who were put on the intensive therapy with the other risk factors right from the beginning, compared to the conventional therapy of that time, they reaped the benefit of reduction in the microvascular and also macrovascular complication. If you look into this bar chart, wherein patients on the intensive therapy compared to the brown chart, that is the conventional therapy, death from cardiovascular disease is less, strokes are less, myocardial infarction is less, CABG requirement is less, primary angioplasty is less, revascularization procedures were less, even the amputations were on the lesser side. So with the multifactorial approach, you are able to achieve both micro and macrovascular complication on the lesser side. But patient need to be addressed hypertension strictly, lipid parameters strictly, appropriate use of antiplatelet agents, and also anti-hyperglycemic agents. Even the same time, we got the UKPDS follow-up study, wherein in the initial study, there was no benefit on the macrovascular benefits, but subsequently came with the UKPDS follow-up study, wherein initial patients, earlier they were not getting the benefit, but they subsequently got a benefit, both the microvascular and the macrovascular therapy. And this, they call it as a legacy effect. In the DCCT and EDICT trial, they call it as a memory effect. So these trials were done in the West, in Europe and America. That's why they called it as the legacy and memory effect. I feel if it would have been done in India, we would have called it as a karma effect. That's a do good things and good things will come your way. So that's why I think when we approach a patient, we need to look at the patient's duration. That is the problem with the ACCORD and the ADVANCE. What is the life expectancy of the patient? What are the comorbidities patient has got? Is whether the patient has got established vascular complication or is at risk of those things? And what is the patient's attitude and what is the resource and the support patient has got? Based on that, we need to fix a HbA1c and we need to start treating. Then only we'll get the benefit. That we call it as an individualization of the HbA1c with all other risk factors. Then the question comes, if you look into the UKPDS and STENO, even a UKPDS follow, we have got to use the multiple agents to achieve the same benefit. And we have to wait for a longer period, at least 10 years in a UKPDS and more than 5 years in a STENO2 trial. And also we need to do a balancing effects in the form of risks and a benefit, wherein we want to achieve a strict control. We need to take care of the hypoglycemia, falls, cost, number of medication, deaths, and the drug side effect. If you relax the control, we'll be having more of a symptoms because of hyperglycemia, microvascular complication, even a macrovascular complication. Then the question comes, whether this both micro and the macrovascular complication, can it be done with one single agent and how can we achieve this? This got answered by a many recent trial addressing the SGLT2 receptors, that is the SGLT2 inhibitors. What they do is just they block the glucose reabsorption in the PCT, promote glycosuria. This one single benefit is going to have a huge impact on the patient's cardiovascular and also a renal effect. What they have seen is, yes, with glycosuria, there is reduction in the HbA1c, glucotoxicity comes, insulin resistance comes down, beta cell function gets improved, body weight comes down. That's one of the most important contributor for a cardiovascular disease. And with natriuresis and osmotic diuresis, there is decrease in the plasma volume, especially the interstitial fluid. Blood pressure comes down. Reduction in the glomerular hyperfiltration happens with both glycemic and extra glycemic benefit. We are going to reap metabolic, that's a good control of a glycemia, cardiovascular benefit, and renal improvement, and much more metabolic benefits have been seen in the form of reduction of visceral fat and also a NASH. So our goal in any patient who are at risk for a complication is to prevent major heart attack, that's a major macrovascular complication, stroke, and also requiring for a complication, that's a nephropathy requiring a hemodialysis. I think our goal should be to prevent all these things. This can be achieved by individualizing the therapy with focus on all risk factors to have a better CV outcomes. Holistic approach is the most important for both micro and macrovascular complication. We need to start controlling right from the beginning, and it should be an aggressive control, not to achieve a strict control after 10 years or 15 years. And we know that benefits of early metabolic intervention, they persist and they increase with time. What we have learned from the UKPDS legacy effect and also DCCT EDICT trial, what we call it as a legacy effect or a memory effect. So thank you for your. I think
Vagesh, I think you have given the entire message very beautifully. And let's discuss few points that comes out of your lecture. We have about 11 minutes left from your lecture time. You rightly left. I told you to leave that time. Now, it was found in your patient because the doctor, you investigated that the patient had a BMI of 25.7, had a weight of 70 kg, and I was saying for a 165 centimeter, he is more than 6 kg overweight.
Yes, sir.
He also had, you have rightly pointed out in the red, H1C, which was definitely much above than 6.5, 7.4. He had creatinine of 1.4 and eGFR of 62, well below 90. And he had the minimally altered lipid profile, but there's nothing called minimal. He had LDL above 100, 108. He had TG above 150, 168. So, what I want to drive home, what's your message to the thousands people joined today, that what should be the screening pattern for the complications? Very brief answer.
Yeah. Our patient was a type 2 diabetic patient. We know that natural history of type 2 diabetes is much before we make a clinical diagnosis. Screen for all microvascular complication, and also if patient has got an additional risk factor for a macrovascular complication right from the diagnosis.
I also observed Vagesh, that you also had this patient who had a family history of hypertension.
Yes, sir.
Hypertension family history also clusters with the diabetic nephrokidney disease. So
Yes.
I think beautifully you have put this case. Yes, please continue. Continue.
So that's why. And this patient was at risk of a macrovascular complication because there was a premature coronary artery disease in the family. That's a father had a thing. I think this is the patient who is at risk of developing this, and this has to be investigated from the beginning. And we need to control his glycemia with the agent which addresses not only a microvascular and also a macrovascular complication and additional risk factors. That's why I feel the best drug which has to be added for him now is the SGLT2 inhibitors, so that his weight comes down, glycemia control happens, his hypertension will be much more better, his even a EGFR which is worsened will prevent further worsening. Sometimes even maybe an improvement in the EGFR happens, and we are going to prevent him from developing what he further developed at the young age.
Thank you. Now, I just wanted to ask you, for our benefit of people, how important is the weight control? How much will put your money on weight control?
I think weight control is a very important thing. In fact, I couldn't show that slide. There is one slide which I just, I think because of lack of time, I didn't include. For every 3 kg increment which happens with any therapy involved in type 2 diabetes, it is going to negate the benefit of 1% reduction in the HbA1c. Means in the process of treating and controlling the glycemia, if a patient gets 3 kg weight gain, you are going to lose all the benefit what we have got from a 1%.
I would like to emphasize your words again to the audience. Any 3 kg weight gain nullifies even 1% reduction in the H1C, which you have achieved. I think it's a great message you have given. Now, what are the complications of diabetes that are related to lipid tension? I count lipid tension, that is hypertension plus hyperlipidemia. What are the complications you will link to these two?
Coronary artery disease and cerebrovascular accidents are the much more, and also peripheral vascular disease. It worsens if patient has got already an established nephropathy and the retinopathy. Almost all the complications gets worsened with the hypertension, more so with the macrovascular complication.
And that's why hypertension control, going back to UG days, more important than the blood glucose control. Rightly, you rightly gave the message. And invariably, 68% CAD and 16% stroke is the what hypertension gives to us. And also its effect on the retinopathy, what you rightly pointed out, cannot be written out. Now tell us that how can you delay the progress of the CKD? What is the management which is non-kidney replacement management? It's a conservative management which can delay the progression of CKD. CKD is a huge problem. It's about 35%. And how can you delay the progression of the CKD by conservative management? It will be a great message to the audience, Vagesh.
I think one most important message we need to know that once the person develops a nephropathy, our glycemia takes the back seat. It's the hypertension which takes the front seat. I think hypertension management has to be very good, and we have to individualize in the younger patients. In fact, I like to treat closer to 120/75 than a 130/80, what the majority of our recommendations do tell. That is one. Second, we have agents now which have shown a proven benefit in a patient who has got a nephropathy, especially if they have onset of a microalbuminuria or even a overt proteinuria. With the addition of a SGLT2 inhibitors over a time, whether it's a DAPA-CKD study or even CREDENCE study, has shown that there is a huge benefit in the nephropathy prevention and progression with SGLT2 inhibitor. I think that's the most important. Hypertension control. Next, the addition of a SGLT2 inhibitor makes a huge benefit in preventing progression of nephropathy.
Good. I think great message. I think, Vagesh, for the benefit of our audience, how much importance will you give it to a diet in a conservative management of diabetic CKD?
I think there are lots of myths about the CKD diet in our country. We are predominantly in protein deficient diet. So vegetarian protein need not be restricted to the great extent what the animal protein needs to be restricted. I feel that if somebody is a vegetarian, predominantly taking a little amount, in fact, hardly 20 to 25% is the protein intake in our population. That's the max. I don't think we have to prevent that in our patient, especially if it is a vegetable protein. Yes, animal protein, if they are taking, yes, there has to be some amount of a restriction, but otherwise vegetable protein, there need not be much restriction.
Great.
Second thing,
great message.
Yes.
Second, yes.
Yes, sir. Second thing is restrict. If patient's potassium is on the higher side, then only we have to restrict the high potassium intake thing. If potassium remains normal, we have seen in the early part of a microalbuminuria, majority of the time it remains normal. I think they can have a normal potassium diet. That's the second most important thing which I like to stress.
Yeah,
and the salt restriction is the most important for a hypertension and also for a nephropathy.
I think I have a very important question to ask, Vagesh. That is depending to UKPDS. Now tell me that why in the UKPDS the macrovascular complication control was delayed or was not achieved. It is because they did not address the multifactorial origin of macrovascular disease, or what was the reason why there was a delay and why there was a very less effect?
Yeah. The one thing is, yes, sir, you have rightly told that for macrovascular complications, we need to address the multifactorial hypertension, lipids needs to be targeted. That's why there was a small subset of a group in a UKPDS wherein they addressed the hypertension very aggressively. That group had a much more benefit of a macrovascular disease compared to the original cohort. That's the most important one thing. Second thing, UKPDS had all the new onset type 2 diabetic patients. So macrovascular complication do take a time to establish. Microvascular complications are glycemia dependent. So macrovascular, they take a time to show the benefit. That's why it took nearly 10 years to show the benefit, whereas microvascular complications were quite immediate. Even at the end of 5 years, there was huge benefit.
I think absolutely. That's why you emphasize on the total holistic management. And you said that is the order of the day. If you really want to postpone both micro and macrovascular complications, you have to give a complete holistic management. And today in the armamentarium, we have all the things that you can play with. Before I close, I have two things to ask you.
Yes.
These are very, very important questions because now we are living in the era of SGLT2. Now, before I forget anything else, how much importance you give to the lipid lowering? I think lipid lowering should also take a front seat. I mean, your thoughts on that?
Yes, sir. I think it is most important lipid because if you look into the contribution of the different parameters to the cardiovascular disease, among the lipids, hypertension and the glycemia is the least. In fact, yes, lipids and hypertension, they take much higher importance than the glycemia. I think it is as important as our hypertension lipids. And the most important, the lipid therapy has to be lifelong. It is not like a 3 months or a 1 year.
People stop it, again lipids goes high, and they do not bring it down as the guidelines say. They're happy with minimal. I think habit changes very, very late. You take out habit, you take out A, bit remains. You take out H, it remains. So it's very difficult to change the habit. I think what we need today is the change of mindset. Last 2 questions, single sentence answer in last minute. Can you summarize again pleiotropic benefits of SGLT2? You said about cardio-renal, weight, NASH, but can you summarize in 1 sentence?
I think it's a holy grail for the prevention of micro and macrovascular complications of not only diabetes, even the metabolic syndrome.
Yeah, absolutely. And it can be used also in the pre-diabetics.
Yes,
I think Professor Zargar is here. It can be used and it gives a lot of benefits even in pre-diabetes, which have started using it. Last, is SGLT2 for all?
For all diabetics, yes.
Yeah,
Because
why diabetics? SGLT2 for the cardiac disease, CKD.
Yes,
diabetics also. Umesh Khanna from Bombay has
definitely for a gastroenterologist, cardiologist, nephrologist, and also an endocrinologist. Yeah, true, sir.
Thank you. Great, Vagesh. I think we got a great message from you, and we are correctly dot on time. Mala, I can see Mala is here. We'll be giving you the forum at about 5:15 sharp. Dear friends, I have a great Mala exactly at 5:15 time. I have now a great guy, Sujoy Ghosh, and he is the author of Treat India, the ultimate on the teneligliptin. He's also the author of the QRST trial, which was published last year. He's also the author of the Intense trial, which was done by his senior colleague Suvankar and others in this whole India study. So I have picked up Sujoy. Is phenomenal. He's a full professor at the PGMAT. He is the president, he is the secretary, he is the editor par excellence of all the journals that we look today, and he is the rising star. Is going to speak to us on a molecule, Mala, which is very passionate about. You know why? Me and Rajesh and all of us, Jargar, we sit in the DCGI. So we are going through what is the gliptin. The nation wants to know in ordnance language which sells maximum in the country. It is not Sita. It is not Lina. It is not Vilda. Believe me, last month, the highest selling gliptin is teneligliptin. So I wanted Sujoy to speak to us. Teneligliptin, the still reigns supreme. Sujoy, all is yours.
Sujoy, you have been upgraded.
So thank you so much for that kind introduction. And actually, I was a bit surprised that, at this point of time, somebody wants to listen to gliptins when everybody's talking about only GLP-1s and SGLT2 inhibitors.
The next one, Sujoy, I'll ask you a combination of teneli with SGLT2. That's my top question for you. Yes, please continue. Sorry.
So I have actually tried to steer clear of controversies, and just going back to teneligliptin, I thought I would start with a case scenario. A 41-year-old gentleman, poor guy, works in a meat shop and has become diabetic. He recently got admitted in a government hospital with COVID, had to be treated with steroids. And in that big halla-gulla of the COVID hospitals, there's no documentation of HbA1c at presentation. So we don't know whether it's steroid-induced or whether it was pre-existing diabetes. He was detected to have hyperglycemia during the steroid therapy, started on insulin, was discharged with a prescription of insulin, but he has stopped all of it. He believes his high blood glucose readings are all to do with his steroids. He does not have diabetes. That's what he started thinking. There is no family history of diabetes. So he thinks, then where on earth would I have got diabetes from? His friends and family insist that he gets reassessed. He somehow managed to give a blood sample which shows an A1C of 10.2. But he refuses to go to the hospital and doctors because he thinks the third wave is now coming. So he's called up his family physician for advice. So we'll come back to this case at the end of my presentation. So, this is one common slide that you would have seen in every teneligliptin talk. which talks about the J-shaped anchor lock domain, which probably accounts for much greater receptor activity and duration of action, and more selectivity than the commonly used, the so-called premium gliptins, and has got a long half-life of almost 24 hours. And, this is the kind of summary which some of the pharma companies have gone on talking about. It's just like Tendulkar wearing the 10 jersey. They call of this as the 10 commandments of teneligliptin. The higher DPP-4 selectivity, significant DPP-4 inhibition, great glycemic efficacy, and even if you switch over from one gliptin to the other, it works. Renal friendly, hepatic friendly, cardiac friendly, though few question marks there, I'll talk about it. It also binds to the DPP-4 substrate, which probably impacts greater efficacy. Of course, cost effectiveness and daily dosing. I think even in the previous talk when Dr. Rajput was talking, we were all talking about how SGLT2 is now cost effective. We were not being able to say that maybe a couple of months ago also. So India is a very cost sensitive nation, so we've got to think of costs as well. So Teneli is probably the best of the gliptins, and we've tried to use this mnemonic of better convenience, established Indian evidence, safety, and tried and tested. So let us look at all of those aspects. So, better convenience in terms of once daily dosing. Now, this is essentially a head-on take of teneligliptin versus vildagliptin, because, vildagliptin has been conventionally used as 50 milligrams twice daily. And though we now do have 100 milligram once daily vildagliptin preparations, in terms of the DPP-4 inhibition, we now have data of vildagliptin, but whether the clinical efficacy and outcomes is identical of 50 twice daily versus the 100 once OD preparation is still to stand the test of time. And we know that taking a drug once daily, of course, is always a better option than having to take it multiple times. And because it's got a long half-life, it can be given once daily. Now, the other issues, because, since Vilda has gone off patent, people would say, hang on, why not Vilda and why Teneli? So the other issues are, if you look at the product insert of Galvus, you will find that it does talk about if you're using it with the sulfonylurea, you're supposed to use it 50 milligram once daily, possibly because of the risk of hypoglycemia. And with alterations of renal function, we are supposed to adjust the dose of vildagliptin. And also in liver dysfunction, we might have to worry about vildagliptin. So these are probably a few differentiators of Teneli from vildagliptin. And in terms of the Indian evidence, essentially there are 4 major studies of teneligliptin published from India. I was fortunate to be part of this data analysis and this publication of Treat India 1, which essentially looks at the real world data of over 4,000 individuals that were followed up. The essential thing that this real world study tried to look at was to show, is Teneli effective or not? So it was essentially more to do with efficacy rather than side effect profile of our patients. And as you can see, not surprisingly, only less than about 4% were on monotherapy of teneligliptin. And most people, like in India, are on multiple drugs in terms of glucose lowering. And of them, some of them were on triple drugs. Some of them were on a combination of metformin. Very, very common thing to happen. And remember, because when this first came in, it being a cheaper option, it went down to the primary care level where most people who have progressive or more aggressive diabetes are seen. I am fortunate to work in a government tertiary care hospital and in a corporate hospital where we see patients who are possibly less neglected. But the primary care physician who's seeing the patient, he would be having to use 3 drugs, 4 drugs to control blood glucose. What's important to realize is that the HbA1c reduction was good, anywhere around the tune of 1%, with a fasting glucose reduction of between 40 to 50, and also a postprandial reduction of 65 to 80. I think one of the things that gliptin has taught us is, unlike what the Western world told us, that gliptins are predominantly drugs that lower postprandial glucose, because the action of the drug is such that it is dependent on the incretin effect, you can clearly see that the fasting glucose reduction is also very, very robust. This we followed up with another study, that's the Treat India 2 study, And here the numbers went up from about 4,500 in Treat India 1 to over 10,000 people in Treat India 2 study. And again, we try to replicate what we had found already in Treat India 1 in terms of the A1C reduction, and the fasting and the postprandial glucose reduction, and that it worked in all of the combinations, whether you see across the board monotherapy, metformin, metformin SU, plus an AGI, and you name the combination, it worked. The most important thing in the Treat India 2 that we looked at, which was different from Treat India 1, was to look at whether the drug worked equally well across ranges of EGFR and what happened to individuals across the range of age groups. So if you look at the differences, individuals with renal impairment, that is stage 3 and beyond, they kind of have similar kind of glucose lowering irrespective of the fact that they had poor kidney function. And if you look at individuals across the age, particularly the elderly age group, there seemed to be almost identical HbA1c reduction. So telling us this drug works across the spectrum of renal dysfunction, and this drug works across the spectrum of age of individuals. So that's the most important bit of take from Treat India 2 study. So coming to the next bit, one of the things that we have always worried about is the QT prolongation issue of teneligliptin. So this is a study by Dr. Erande's group, which showed that if you use teneligliptin and you follow them up to about 3 months, there is no difference in the QT interval or the corrected QT before the start of therapy till the end of therapy, and that there was no significant prolongation of QT. We followed that up with another publication 2 months ago, that's the QSET-2 study, to look at QT prolongation, safety and effectiveness of teneligliptin in an Indian population. And here we had patients even who had been up-titrated to doses of 40 milligrams of teneligliptin. And you can see, in addition to what has already been established in terms of the good glycemic control, we were able to show that there was no difference in the QT and the QTC, with no changes in at least 90 days follow-up of the use of this particular drug. So it remained the same before and after the therapy. Now, coming to one of the other issues, looking at safety at in individuals in India at higher dose. This is a 40 milligram study, which shows that people who are inadequately treated, pushing up the dose might actually improve the glycemic control. And then again, one of my colleagues from Kolkata, he's part of the Initiate study, which looked at the efficacy of the combination of metformin with teneligliptin, which is again a very common thing, which again shows that the combo did very well in terms of glycemic lowering, in terms of fasting, postprandial, and HbA1c. Now, Dr. Mohan's group did another study to look at people on teneligliptin and compare it with those individuals who are on sitagliptin, because we have this tendency of thinking that, whatever is cheap is probably not great. So if you look at this study, you can see that there was no difference between the glycemic control of teneligliptin versus sitagliptin statistically. If at all, there was probably a little bit of benefit towards the teneli rather than the sita, and of course, no difference in the QT and the QTC. This is again a recent study looking at time in range with the use of teneligliptin. Because of lack of time, I'll quickly go through this study. Look at the study flow. There are essentially 3 phases of the study. The first bit where the CGM was done, pre-treatment and post-treatment, that followed by the time when the individual was on teneligliptin, and then a post-treatment looking at follow-up period at around 1.5 months. What is interesting and exciting to know that in addition to glucose improvement, that is A1C, fasting and postprandial, the CGM parameters improved dramatically. The time in range improved with the initiation of teneligliptin, and that it was sustained. The time above range was cut down, and as you can see, the patient did really well. So in addition to the 3 normal parameters of glycemic control, you can see that the time in range bit also actually improved. Now, in terms of the safety, I've already talked about that, about 50% of the drug is excreted through the urine and 50% through the feces. Therefore, it's relatively balanced. And as you can see, teneli at the bottom, you can use it all through the entire period of time for management of diabetes, irrespective of what the degree of renal dysfunction is. In terms of the hepatic dysfunction, again, remember we are talking about chronic liver disease and not acute liver disease. In acute liver disease, you should probably be avoiding all oral agents. In chronic liver disease, at least in child A and B, you can use teneligliptin. In child C, even though there is very small data of about 11 or 12 patient data, it's probably not very wise to suggest using the drug in such a scenario, which of course has been highlighted to be very different from what the situation is with some of the other gliptins. In terms of the cardiovascular outcome, we now have a real world data comparing teneligliptin with sulfonylureas. This is not a placebo control and this is not an RCT. And what was looked at was all-cause mortality, hospitalization due to heart failure, myocardial infarction, stroke, 3-point MACE, and severe hypoglycemia. There does not seem to be much of a difference except for the hypo risk when you compare teneli versus glimepiride. Now, we already know from the linagliptin versus the glimepiride study, that's the Carmelina and the Carolina studies, that probably now we are not that skeptical anymore about the cardiovascular outcomes of the newer sulfonylurea. So if you're comparing it with that, this is safe in terms of that. So Dr. Das sir was talking about the various DPP4 inhibitors and how they got approval in India. You can see the last of the gliptins that got approval was teneligliptin. After that, even though we have alogliptin and the other drugs. But what he has quite correctly told us is about the number of people who have been treated with. If you look at Sita in combination, there's been 11 lakh patients, Vilda in combinations, 12.5 lakh patients, linagliptin, 3.5 lakh people. But look at teneli and its combinations. 34 lakh Indians had been on teneligliptin. And if you look at the proportion of gliptin share, more than 50% of patients who are on gliptins in India are on teneligliptin. Now, having said that, we know that probably, the IDF Atlas is going to come out this week itself, that close to 8 crore individuals in India are on having diabetes. Yet, only 1 out of 10 patients with diabetes is getting a gliptin, which tells us the scope that we still have for our patients to be put on gliptins. And with the ever-increasing number of patients who are going to develop diabetes, irrespective of what we do, there is a huge unmet need for gliptins. As one of my teachers would say, there's probably a gliptin deficiency in our patients with diabetes. I shall stop there.